Before a family lost the farm, before they sold the last tool, before they packed children, blankets, and cooking pots into a wagon, there was almost always one last meal being stretched over the stove, and that meal rarely seemed important enough to enter the history books. It was not a banquet, or a beautiful tradition, or a recipe passed down with pride in a clean notebook, but the last attempt to make too little seem like enough before everyone inside the house realized that it no longer was. These 27 meals are not just old recipes, and they are not here because they sound strange, rustic, or forgotten, because each one works as silent evidence of what ordinary American farm families did when the land stopped answering and hunger came through the door. When crops failed, hunger did not usually arrive first as a public tragedy because it began inside the house, in the shrinking size of the bread, in the broth that received more water, in the meat that disappeared from the table, in the coffee that grew weaker, and in the silence of adults eating less so the children would not notice too soon that something had gone wrong. In the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl, parts of America's agricultural heartland were transformed by drought, erosion, and dust storms into a landscape where many families could no longer live off the land. And before those families became archival photographs, government reports, or symbols of the Great Depression, they were people sitting in front of poor plates, trying to decide how to make a sack of flour last one more week. They were trying to tow dried corn into 2 meals, trying to reuse old grease without letting it spoil, trying to keep a house feeling like a house when dust came through the cracks and covered furniture, beds, plates, and hope. But this story does not belong only to the Great Plains, because poor farmers, sharecroppers, tenant families, and rural laborers across the United States went through their own versions of the same pressure, always discovering that survival food is born when the weather, the market, the landlord, the bank, or the debt pushes a family to the edge of an empty table. If this kind of history changes the way you see old food, not as nostalgia and not as curiosity, but as proof that ordinary families survived when the land, the weather, and the economy turned against them, then this is the kind of past this channel follows. Because every forgotten meal carries more than ingredients. It carries the silence of people who had to stretch, save, dilute, and divide what was left to keep someone they loved alive for one more day. Number 27. Cornmeal mush that came back to the table the next day for a family of farmers on the Great Plains in the years when drought turned crops into dust and made dirt slip through the cracks of houses as if it too wanted a seat at the table. Cornmeal mush was not a simple food, but a strategy for getting through one more day without admitting that the farm had stopped answering. Cornmeal had an advantage few ingredients had in a rural kitchen broken by crisis, because it could be stored dry, cooked with water, thickened without milk, served hot at night, and, when it hardened overnight, sliced and fried the next morning in a spoonful of reused grease. During the Dust Bowl, farm families across the plains faced failed harvests, ruined soil, and a kind of dust that did not stay outside, because it entered homes, covered beds, settled on plates, and made even the act of eating feel tied to the land's collapse. The quiet power of this dish was that it could return to the table wearing another form, and for a mother feeding children in a dust-covered house, that small illusion mattered, because the food had not changed, but it needed to pretend that it had. Number 26. Bone soup with skins and roots. Bone soup belonged to farmers who had already used the meat, sold the animal, or divided what little there was among too many people, but still could not throw away what remained, because an almost bare bone, when boiled long enough, could still give off fat, smell, and the illusion of substance. In kitchens hit by bad harvests, debt, or long winters, potato skins, stalks, small roots, and rejected pieces of vegetables were placed into the same pot, not because they formed a harmonious recipe, but because hunger reorganized the logic of the house, making everything that had once been a scrap start to be treated as a possibility. For poor American farm families, especially during the Great Depression, waste was not only careless but dangerous, because every small thing thrown away might later be remembered as something that could have stretched a meal, thickened a broth, or given a child one more warm spoonful. Nobody measured that soup by what it contained, but by how many people it could reach. And in a poor rural house, a thin pot could be the difference between sleeping completely hungry and sleeping with the body fooled by warmth. Number 25, hot water bread with old flour. Hot water bread was food for people who still had flour, but almost nothing else to turn that flour into real bread, because it required no milk, no eggs, no yeast, and no butter. Only boiling water, salt, and a quick mixture that created a simple, heavy, and possible dough. For sharecroppers and tenant families in the American South, especially in times of low crop prices and dependence on landowners, basic ingredients like flour and grease had enormous value, because a season of work could still end with debt, and the harvest could leave a family with less security than they had imagined when planting began. That bread was not beautiful, it did not rise lightly, yet it did not promise comfort, but it could be broken, wrapped, taken to the field, and shared among children when there was no meat to pack and no extra food to spare. And when a family had no vegetables, no eggs, no fresh milk, and no certainty about tomorrow, they could still hold a piece of warm bread in their hands and feel, for a few minutes, that the house was still working. Number 24, boiled potato with salt, when there was still salt. A boiled potato with salt seems too plain to carry a hard history, but for many poor rural families in the United States, it was one of the most direct ways to turn a cheap, heavy, storable food into survival, especially when meat had left the table and flour needed to last longer than it should. During the Great Depression, farm families faced falling prices, debt, lost land, and in many regions, environmental stress that made each season feel uncertain, so foods that could be stored, boiled with almost nothing, and served in small portions gained a value that does not appear when we look only at the recipe. The potato, in that context, was not a pretty side dish, but volume, heat, and some small measure of security inside the pot, because it could be boiled with the skin on, divided among several people, and served with salt, when there was still enough salt to give the meal a trace of care. A boiled potato only looked poor while it existed, because when a family had no meat, no eggs, no milk, and not enough bread, even one plain potato placed at the center of the table could mean the difference between a completely empty night and a meal small enough to keep the household moving. Number 23, flour gravy made without meat that was not there. And that is why it may be one of the most honest dishes of rural poverty, because it mixed flour, fat, and water to create something thick enough to cover dry bread, potatoes, or biscuits, even when no roast had passed through the kitchen. In families hit by the Great Depression, the absence of meat was not just a matter of taste, because animals could be sold, slaughtered carefully, or preserved to produce milk, eggs, labor, or future income. And a spoonful of grease saved from another meal had to carry the flavor of something the house could no longer serve. The detail that makes this dish powerful is that it imitated the gravy of a better meal. But for that very reason, it exposed the absence of that meal, creating thickness where abundance should have been. Everyone at the table could dip bread into that pale sauce and taste an incomplete promise, as if the family were eating the shadow of a dinner that would have existed in less difficult times. Number 22, watery beans with hard bread. Watery beans were food for rural families who understood the value of every dry grain, because a handful of beans, when cooked slowly and diluted with plenty of water, could become a large pot, carry dinner, return the next day, and still receive hard bread to thicken the broth. During agricultural crises, dry foods were a defense against instability because they lasted longer than milk, meat, or fresh vegetables, And this mattered especially for farmers who could lose income and food at the same time when the harvest failed. The hard bread entered the bowl as a second chance for something that already seemed dead, absorbing broth, gaining texture, and increasing the feeling of weight in the stomach without requiring anything new from the pantry. No one needed to say what that meal was really doing, because the family was not just preparing beans, they were calculating how many bowls could come out of that pot before someone had to admit that the sack of grain was coming to an end. Number 21. Corn cakes fried in reused grease. Corn cakes were the kind of food that could seem more generous than they really were, because cornmeal or ground corn mixed with water and salt could be fried in small portions and served as if each piece had been made with intention, even when the truth was that there were not enough ingredients for a larger meal. For poor American farmers, corn had enormous importance precisely because of its versatility, because it could become mush, bread, dough, cakes, animal feed, and reused leftovers. And in times of crisis, this multiplication of uses made a difference. The grease used for frying was rarely wasted because it could be strained, saved, and used again, carrying the flavor of previous meals, as if the kitchen's own memory were being reused. The frying gave the cakes an almost festive appearance, and a child could receive them as if they were a treat, while the adult serving them knew that the small golden crust was a delicate way of hiding scarcity. Number 20. Turnip, leaf, and stalk soup. Turnip, leaf, and stalk soup was food for families who could no longer separate what was pretty from what was edible, because in times of crop failure, harsh winter, or prolonged poverty, the rejected part of the plant began to hold the same moral value as the part that could be sold. Turnips and hardy roots had an important place in many poor rural kitchens because they could withstand cold, be stored for a time, and add volume to the pot, while leaves and stalks, even tough or bitter, offered something that water alone could not. In farm households where the market price of crops could decide whether a family bought supplies or went without, the parts of vegetables that could not be sold could still become a kind of private survival, returning to the kitchen after the better portions had gone elsewhere. A family did not need to say out loud that things had gotten worse, because the soup itself said it, showing that the house had begun eating parts of the plant that, in better times, no one would have served with pride. Number 19. Cornbread without sugar was a food of endurance, not pleasure, because sugar could be expensive, rare, or saved for a special occasion, while cornmeal, water, salt, and some available grease were enough to create a dense, dry, sturdy bread, strong enough to accompany work in the fields. In the rural South, especially among poor families, tenant farmers, and sharecroppers, corn appeared as a food base because it could be grown, ground, and transformed into many forms of sustenance. But the difference between rich cornbread and crisis cornbread was found in the missing ingredients. When there was no milk, no egg, no butter, and no sugar, what remained was a harder and more direct version, made to fill the body rather than please the memory. The lack of sweetness said something that nobody needed to explain, because a child could bite into that bread and feel that the house still had food, while also feeling that the small luxuries had been removed from the table one by one, in silence, until only the bread remained. Number 18. Potato stew with thin milk. Potato stew with thin milk was food for families who still had something, but not enough to call it abundance, because a few stored potatoes, water, salt, and a little milk could form a pale, warm, soft pot capable of feeding many people without meat. On a poor American farm, a cow could represent one of the last forms of food security, but milk was not always abundant because it depended on the animal's health, the season, available feed, and the difficult decision between consuming it at home or selling it for something the family could not produce. During the Dust Bowl years, when drought and dust storms made agricultural life precarious, anything that could be diluted without disappearing completely gained importance, because volume itself could become part of survival. The milk was added more to suggest care than to enrich the pot, and even so, a warm bowl could make a child feel that home still existed, in a place where almost everything had already been reduced. Number 17. Flour pancakes without eggs. Flour pancakes without eggs appeared when the kitchen needed to preserve the shape of a normal meal, even after losing the ingredients that made that meal complete, because flour, water, salt, and grease could create warm discs that looked like breakfast, dinner, or consolation. For poor rural families, eggs were complicated because they could feed the children, but they could also be sold to buy kerosene, salt, fabric, medicine, or some item impossible to produce at home. This logic was especially cruel for sharecroppers and tenant farmers, who often ended the harvest still in debt, trapped in a cycle where food itself might have to become currency before becoming a meal. The eggless pancake preserved the appearance of a routine, and when a mother served that simple dish on a poor table, she was not just offering fried flour. She was trying to keep standing the feeling that life still obeyed some familiar order, even after almost everything that filled that order had already gone away in silence. Number 16. Broken rice with grease and salt. Broken rice was food for those who could not pay for the prettier version of the same grain, because the broken pieces had less value on the market. But inside a poor pot, they had exactly what mattered: starch, volume, and the ability to sustain. In rural communities and low-income households, products considered commercially inferior could become essential, because poverty often pushes people to the edges of the food system, where the broken grains, bruised fruit, mixed flours, and less valued cuts remain. Cooked with grease and salt, broken rice stopped being a defect and became a meal, especially when it absorbed any broth left from a previous pot or carried the flavor of fat saved from another day. The market saw imperfection where a family saw salvation, and what looked like scraps to someone buying by appearance could mean one more night without complete hunger to someone buying out of necessity. Number 15. Wilted, small, or bruised apples were common in families who lived near orchards or turned into money, but almost every fruit could be sold, stored, or turned into money, but almost every fruit could still be cooked before it rotted. When placed in water, thickened with flour, and, in the rare better moments, sweetened with a little sugar or molasses, those apples became a warm mush that offered flavor, acidity, and an almost luxurious feeling at a table dominated by grains, potatoes, and thin soups. For poor farm families, fruit that did not serve the market could still serve the household, and what buyers rejected for being bruised, small, or soft could be gathered with care, because the kitchen measured value differently than the store. An apple too soft to sell could become the most anticipated part of the day for a child, showing that in times of scarcity, sweetness did not need to be abundant to be remembered. Number 14. Cabbage soup of the long days. Cabbage soup was food of volume, patience, and winter, because cabbage could be cheap, hardy, storable, and capable of filling an entire pot when sliced thin and boiled with water, salt, onion, potato, or any tiny piece of fat. For poor rural families, especially in colder regions of the United States, foods that could withstand storage were more than convenience, because a bad harvest kept hurting months later. When the gardens stopped, the roads became difficult, and buying food required money that might not exist. Cabbage alone did not promise enough strength for a field worker, but inside a hot soup, it could relieve the cold, fill the stomach, and create a meal where before there had only been water. Temperature delivered something calories could not, because a steaming bowl in a cold house could give the body a few minutes of comfort, even when the next day would demand more work than that soup could repay. Number 13. Day-old bread soaked in milk or water. Day-old bread soaked in milk, weak coffee, or hot water was food of extreme reuse, made when the bread had already lost its texture, but had not yet lost its moral obligation to feed someone. In a poor house, old bread was not trash, because every slice carried flour, labor, fire, and time, and wasting it would be almost like throwing away a small part of the chance to survive the week. When there was milk, the dish seemed gentler, almost childlike, But when there was only hot water, it showed scarcity without ornament, turning hardness into something chewable for small children, the elderly, or tired adults. Soaking the bread did not create abundance, but it changed its form. And sometimes that was enough to make a child accept a meal that, if served dry and hard, would reveal the situation of the house too early. Number 12. Fried onion with flour was food of strong smell and weak pantry, because when onion browned in fat, it made the whole house seem richer for a few minutes, even if the final dish was only thickened flour, water, and salt. In poor rural kitchens, aroma had an almost emotional function, because the lack of meat, butter, or broth could be partially hidden by a well-fried onion, capable of creating expectation before it fed anyone. This dish shows that survival was not only the mathematics of calories, but also the management of hope, because a meal that smelled like something was happening could soften the humiliation of a plate that contained almost nothing. The onion made poverty seem cooked with intention, and a family sitting at the table could receive that simple dish as if it had been chosen, when in truth it had been imposed by everything that was absent. Number 11. Dried peas boiled until they fell apart. Dried peas were small reserves of survival because they could be stored for a long time, and when boiled slowly, turned into a thick soup, almost a puree, capable of offering vegetable protein, heat, and sustenance without depending on fresh meat. For poor farmers, dry food was protection against the instability of the land, because a harvest could fail, a garden could freeze, an animal could die. But a sack of peas kept in a dry place still held a promise. The cooking time turned the dish into a collective weight, because everyone knew the pot needed hours to soften what was too hard for haste, and that waiting could make the day feel slightly less uncertain. Pea soup told the family that something was still expected at the end of the day, and that expectation mattered greatly, because hunger does not hurt only when it arrives. It also hurts when no one knows whether there will be anything after the work. Number 10. Green tomato sauce with bread. Green tomatoes were picked before their time, when frost threatened, when disease approached, or when the family no longer trusted that the harvest would arrive ripe at the table. And for that reason, the sauce made from them had an acidic flavor that carried the interruption of the harvest itself. For poor farmers, picking before the right time was not a culinary choice, but a defensive decision, because waiting a few more days could mean losing everything, while gathering hard green fruit at least guaranteed something inside the pot. Cooked with salt, onion, water, and sometimes a little flour, those tomatoes could become a simple sauce for bread, potatoes, or corn, giving acidity and volume to heavier ingredients. Each spoonful tasted like urgency, because the family had to pull food from the plant before nature, disease, or cold made the decision for them. And the green tomato was not what they had chosen, but what remained after the choice was taken away. Number 9. Flour dumplings inside thin soup. Flour dumplings were small pieces of dough cooked inside a thin soup, and their importance was in the fact that they turned seasoned water into a meal, swelling inside the pot, absorbing flavor, and giving the body something to chew. This kind of solution appears in many poor rural traditions because it solves an old problem of farm kitchens. When the broth is thin, flour can multiply the feeling of food without requiring meat, eggs, or fresh vegetables. During the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, many families faced not only lack of money, but also displacement, loss of land, and the rupture of agricultural life. And cooking to stretch food was a skill as practical as planting, mending clothes, or fixing tools. A child who found dumplings in the bowl did not see just soup, but pieces, presents, and something that seemed placed there for them, and that could completely change the experience of a poor meal. Number 8. Hard polenta cut into slices. Hard polenta was food for families who needed to make one pot last longer than one dinner, because corn cooked until thick could be served hot, then left to set, cut into slices, and fried the next day in reused grease. Because cornmeal and ground corn were versatile ingredients, they allowed the same food base to appear in different forms, creating a sense of variety without requiring new ingredients. In a poor rural house, this was not a culinary detail, but a strategy of resistance, because repeating exactly the same bowl every day made scarcity too visible. Sliced polenta pretended to be another dish, and that small illusion had real value, because when an entire life was shrinking around the family, even the impression of novelty could keep the table from looking like a daily confession of failure. Number 7. Rabbit, squirrel, or small game stew. When domestic livestock needed to be preserved, sold, or had already disappeared, small game could enter the pot as a last resort, and rabbits, squirrels, birds, or animals found along the edges of the property became slow stews, stretched with roots, flour, and water. For poor farmers, hunting was not a sport, but an extension of survival. Because the crop could fail, the market might not pay, the pantry could run out. But there was still brush, fence, river, woods, and road, where some form of food might be found. Small meat rarely lasted on its own, so the stew had to turn a little into broth, smell, and small pieces divided with care, making the wild landscape serve the family when the planted field no longer could. This dish marked the moment when the family stopped depending only on its own cultivated land and began reading the entire landscape as a pantry, searching for edible life where before there might have been only the back edge of the property. Number 6. Vinegar pie, when there was no fruit. Vinegar pie was born from the need to imitate a fruit dessert when there was not enough fruit, using acidity, sugar when available, flour, fat, and sometimes eggs to create a pie that recalled lemon, apple, or something richer than the pantry truly allowed. In periods of scarcity, poor desserts had a function that went beyond flavor, because keeping a sweet on the Sunday table during a visit or on a special date helped the family preserve rituals when almost everything else had already been reduced. Vinegar pie shows that hunger does not attack only the stomach, but also customs, because it threatens to turn every day into the same, every dish into urgency, and every meal into calculation. Serving a dessert made from substitution was a way of saying that the family still had an occasion, still had a table, and still had the memory of times when sweetness came from real fruit, instead of from a careful imitation of it. Number 5. Potato soup with the skin on. Potato soup with the skin on was a direct response to the impossibility of wasting anything, because peeling potatoes in times of hunger meant removing part of the food, and when every layer mattered, the skin stopped being a scrap and became an ingredient. For poor American farmers, the potato carried a double truth, because it could sustain a family for a long time, but it also showed how vulnerable a household became when it depended on only a few cheap foods to cross weeks of scarcity. During the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl years, many families reduced meals to basic, storable, inexpensive ingredients, and in that setting, potato soup with the skin on was not rustic style, but a direct answer to the fact that no edible part could be thrown away. The skin revealed the level of need, because in times of abundance it could be removed without thought, but in times of hunger it became part of the bowl, showing that poverty teaches the body to accept what comfort once taught the eyes to reject. Number 4. Biscuits with grease and water. Biscuits made with flour, grease, water, and salt were one of the great foundations of poor rural kitchens, because they could be prepared quickly, baked in the oven or in a heavy pan, and served with gravy, soup, weak coffee, or absolutely nothing. For families in the rural South, especially sharecroppers and agricultural workers, this kind of small bread had practical and emotional value, because flour could be more accessible than meat, and a warm biscuit gave a poor meal the appearance of home food. Under the sharecropping system, many workers farmed landowners' fields in exchange for housing and a share of the crop, but economic dependence and debt could keep those families vulnerable even after months of labor. The biscuit carried normality inside the crisis, because even when the table was almost empty, The smell of dough baking could make the house seem less defeated, as if there were still a domestic routine resisting poverty. Number 3. Weak coffee with bread to fool the body. Weak coffee with hard bread was not a complete meal, but many times it functioned as one, especially for adults who needed to leave for work and preferred to leave the more substantial part of the food for the children. The coffee was diluted, the bread was softened, and the body received heat, liquid, and some weight, even if the real energy was too little for the journey ahead. During the Great Depression, rural families faced a combination of economic collapse, drought, and displacement. And in Dust Bowl country, thousands of farmers carried minimal belongings in search of work elsewhere, bringing not only objects with them, but inherited habits of survival. Many forms of love in times of hunger were not declared, only practiced in silence, inside weak cups, small pieces, and gentle lies told to protect children. Because sometimes an adult saying they had already eaten was simply another way of making the food last. Number 2. Everything soup, made with what the weak left behind. Everything soup was less a recipe and more an inventory of survival, because into it went skins, stalks, grains, leftover pieces of potato, bones already boiled, old grease, cooking water, and pieces too small to form any dish on their own. In poor rural families, the entire week could end inside one pot, because nothing ended its usefulness on the first use, and every leftover had to prove that it could still deliver flavor, texture, starch, or heat. This kind of soup reveals a severe domestic intelligence, built by people who may never have called it technique, but knew exactly how to keep the pantry from running out all at once. The soup gathered the traces of previous meals, like a liquid memory of the week, and when the family sat down to eat, they were not just consuming leftovers. They were confirming that they had crossed enough days to have leftovers to gather. Number 1. Poverty bread, made to cross the hunger. Poverty bread had no single recipe because it could be made with wheat, corn, rye, potato, bran, mixed flour, water, salt, and any available grease. But its essence was always the same: to create something heavy, divisible, and reliable when the harvest failed and the rest of the food disappeared. It takes first place because poor bread appears in almost every story of rural American survival, changing ingredients according to the region, but maintaining the same human function of turning scarcity into pieces that could be divided with some justice. In the Dust Bowl, farm families abandoned land when drought, erosion, and dust destroyed the possibility of living from the farm. While in the rural South and the Great Plains, the combination of debt, low prices, failed harvests, and dependence on the land showed how quickly a farming life could become hungry inside the home. This bread symbolizes not only poverty, but the last attempt to keep a family gathered around the table. Because before someone left down the road, sold what remained, or admitted that the land could no longer sustain anyone, there was often a simple bread being broken in silence. Not as ceremony and not as tradition, but as the last thing holding a family to the place it had always called home. When we look at these meals today, it is easy to call them tradition, simplicity, or old food, because time has a way of softening what people once survived. But the harder question is this: how many humble American farm recipes were not born first from culture, but from fear? How many family dishes began as a way to make hunger quieter, to help children sleep more easily, to make an almost empty pantry feel less final? And how many beautiful memories about the past only exist because someone, in silence, stood before a poor pot and turned despair into dinner?